This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. And yeah, gosh, I'm excited. I have some fun slides to present today. And yeah, I'll just hop right in. So different strokes for different folks. This is a phrase coined by Muhammad Ali, talking about how he has different boxing strategies for different opponents based on their strengths and weaknesses. And this is a really nice parallel for what I'm going to be talking about today, which is that weed species are very different based on their biology and the traits that they have. And so we should really be tailoring our management based on that. So first off, I want to tell you a little bit about my position. I'm mostly extension, and I do try to hit every corner of the state. And I cover all crops, as well as recently added a community IPM component. So I cover backyard gardens and weeds in natural landscapes. And I just want to start by giving some examples of weeds in different systems that I've viewed from my travels across the state. And this is one that kind of stands out, is glyphosate tolerant soybeans, where the farmers are really relying on glyphosate to achieve their weed control. And typically the most problematic weeds in these systems are also tolerant of glyphosate or have developed resistance to glyphosate, as is the case with tall water hemp and horseweed. In grape vineyards, we've established this great trellis system to help our perennial grapevines thrive. And it turns out that there are several perennial vining weeds that also tend to thrive in this environment: hedge bindweed, Virginia creeper, also poison ivy, and others. And so it kind of fits there. And then in greenhouses on benches, I was happy I worked with Betsy last month to attend and present at the Greenhouse IPM in-depth, which is fantastic. And there's a very specific set of weeds in greenhouses on benches. And the one thing that they have in common is that they all can have the ability to forcefully eject their seed and shoot those seeds 5 or 6 feet away, which is enough to hop up onto the benches or into hanging baskets or from pot to pot. And so each of these 3 examples here, I've actually led or co-led trials and have that data up online. I also went into detail in my last horticulture seminar a few years ago, and that's up on the web if you're interested more. And a few other examples of weeds that have come to thrive in different systems. This is a good example here from our AFRI project, looking to try to improve establishment of conifers in the first few years, which it can be very difficult. There's typically high mortality. So one of the sets of treatments that we're looking at is with weed management. So we're comparing cultivation, which is kind of shallowly disturbing the soil. We're doing this about 3 times over the course of the summer. Mowing about once a month, wood chips, which were applied at about a 4-inch depth, and herbicides, which were sprayed in the spring and then in the fall, typically while the trees were still a little bit dormant. And it's interesting because this is side by side. This is all in the same field, and a very similar starting point in terms of which weeds were present. And we're coming into the 3rd year here, and we're still kind of taking data and analyzing the data. But just to anecdotally show you some pictures and tell the story, each of these treatments looks very different nowadays in the 3rd year. So, for example, with cultivation, there is a lot of hairy gallinsoga, and this is one of our fastest weeds to emerge and flower and set seed. It's about 3 weeks from emergence to flowering. So if we're cultivating every 5 or 6 weeks, that's plenty of time for this weed to complete its life cycle. In the mowing system, we don't actually have many weeds per se in this system, but instead we have a lot of our seeded cover crop, which is a mixture of grasses and clovers, which are low growing and require minimal mowing and are actually kind of smothering out the other weed species, it seems. In the wood chip system, this is really dominated by Canada thistle and quackgrass, pictured here. And both of these weeds are perennial with very aggressive root systems, and they spread and have a lot of energy embodied in those root systems, so they can seemingly easily push through 4 inches of wood chip mulch. And then in the herbicide system, this will look very clean, very weed-free for the first month or two after the herbicide applications. But those soil-applied herbicides do break down over time, and so you get some late-season weeds that are able to germinate and come through, like barnyard grass here. Okay, one final systems comparison that shows more of this type of different weed species coming to thrive in different situations. Again, we have, and I should mention this is an organic winter squash. This is a delicata. We have cultivation again compared to a black plastic mulch and a straw mulch applied by hand at a very high but kind of a standard rate of 9 tons per acre, as well as a rolled rye system. And so this is a cover crop, a rye cover crop that is grown over the winter and through the spring, and then is roller crimped to terminate it into a mulch. And midway through the season, most of these are looking pretty good in terms of weed control and crop health. I think the one outlier was the rolled rye system, which we struggled with for a few different reasons. I think there may have been some allelopathy, potentially just colder, more compacted soils, maybe some nitrogen immobilization. But yeah, so we struggled with the rye system a little bit, even though we enacted it in a little bit different ways each year over the 2-year study. But what I really wanted to point out here is the differences in the weed species. And I've used principal components analysis to help tell the story here. I'm just going to kind of highlight a few of the examples. So common purslane was strongly associated with the cultivation treatment. And common purslane kind of makes sense. It has these very thick, waxy leaves, and it's often able to survive cultivation by rerooting and taking some of the energy stored in the leaves and making new roots. And common ragweed was strongly associated with the rolled rye treatment. Matt Ryan and others have shown this before, in that the ragweed is one of our earliest emerging species. So it's able to emerge before we roll down the rye into a suppressive mulch. Winter wheat, we don't think of typically as a weed, but it's a plant out of place in this context. And interestingly, this was a winter wheat straw. So I'm wondering where this winter wheat came from. And actually, most of the time when I see straw in use, it does bring in a significant amount of grain. We were lucky that this was winter wheat straw rather than oats or spring wheat, because those would have grown very tall and headed out, whereas winter wheat requires a vernalization or overwintering period and stayed low growing for us. There was a lot of smartweed. There were a few different species of smartweeds, and they were mixed throughout the trial. I think that there was just generally a high level of smartweed seeds in the soil, in the seed bank. So just by sheer numbers, they were able to make their way through our treatments. So what I'm really showing and trying to show in all of these examples is something called community assembly theory, which is more of an ecological principle that can be applied to weeds, in that the species that come to dominate or thrive in a particular field are really a function of what's there to begin with, and which of those species can make their way through various filters. The filters can be abiotic, like temperature, climate filters, They can be biotic, like weed to weed or plant-plant interactions, herbivory. But a lot of times the strongest filters determining the presence of weeds, which ones survive or not, is human management. It's the tillage, it's the herbicides that are used. These really impact the success of weeds. And a nice way to visualize this is through a Swiss cheese model, and you may have seen this in a different context at the height of COVID, and that you want to wear a mask, you want to social distance, get vaccinated. Each of these things, stacking them together, reduces the likelihood that a viral particle will slip through and cause you to get sick. And it's the same type of principle with weeds. So some of the differences between weed species that can impact their success include their life cycle. Are they an annual that produces thousands of seeds, or are they a perennial that is perhaps more reliant on spreading via the roots? Monocots tend to have a growing point, a meristem that is protected at the soil line, whereas dicots, the meristem is up on the ends of the shoots and exposed to things like mowing or flame weeding or contact herbicides. The morphology, the height and spreading nature of weeds is another important factor, as is the photosynthesis type, which can impact the success of a plant in drought years or wet years. And there's many other traits. Some of these are down to the molecular level, like how the species respond to herbicides. Do they have the molecular shapes of some of their mechanisms at the cellular level that allows herbicides to bind and block particular mechanisms that are important to the plant? Can the plant metabolize certain herbicides to simply make them ineffective? And one of the important factors that determines the success of different weed species that you may not think about, or at least I didn't for a while, was when do weeds tend to emerge? And different species tend to emerge at different times of the year, typically based on the accumulation of growing degree days. And this is some work led by Matt Ryan that I took a piece of and added some review to, and showed that species some species anyways, like say barnyard grass here, have an emergence peak that can be targeted by management. So for example, this shaded band here is a hypothetical emergence peak. And here I have a few different examples or scenarios of ways farmers might target that peak. So the crop here is represented by these vertical lines increasing in height. And then the X's represent various direct controls like herbicides or tillage or cultivation. So one simple way is to simply consolidate some of your direct controls during that period when weeds are just emerging. They're very small. And when weeds are small, they're most susceptible to direct control. That's when they're kind of the weakest. Another way is to ensure that you have residual herbicides overlapping during this important period of emergence. And similarly with residue mulches, those mulches break down over time. So ensuring that that's applied before the emergence peak is important. Planting later can help farmers just simply avoid an emergence peak if they have that flexibility. And planting earlier can get the crop established and give it a height advantage over the emerging weeds. A fallow period is excellent, and I think kind of the gold standard if the farmer has that flexibility to simply repeatedly till or spray during that period to control those emerging weeds without having to worry about damaging their crop potentially. And a cover crop can achieve a similar effect. So a little bit more on thinking about which crops might be used or be adjusted to fit the timing of when weeds emerge in a particular field. if the weeds are emerging in the early part of the season, if the problematic species, like a lot of our summer annuals, emerge around this time, farmers may consider shifting to later planting periods to avoid that period, or use crops like alfalfa or winter cereals that are established ahead of time and have a competitive advantage through that. For mid-season weeds, it's a little tricky. A farmer may try to use short-season crops to avoid this peak emergence period. And then for late-season weeds, which are typically winter annuals, earlier crops will allow the harvest and get the crop out of the field so that you can then take care of the weeds again without having to worry about having the crop in the way. And the other thing we did with this work was look at the previous literature and for each of the species that we were interested in, and kind of initiate a bit of a virtual common garden experiment, in that we're using these models that were created, which are primarily based on growing degree days, and then plugging in the same data for each of these models based on hardiness zones that are found in New York. So 4A would be like up in the Adirondacks, 7A would be down on Long Island. And yeah, for most of these, the data corresponded to what we had found experimentally. But yeah, it was interesting, and I guess it makes sense that there was about a month and a half difference between when a given species would be predicted to emerge in a warmer climate versus a cooler climate. And one of the kind of initially perplexing things was that some of these models were very different, and for two of these, that can be explained in that they're winter annuals that can also be summer annuals. So I think that they're modeling two different populations. But some of these, like redroot pigweed, these are summer annuals, and there's quite a variation with when the models predicted emergence. And I think this shows that there are population level differences, in that pigweed in one part of, say, the US or Europe or wherever may emerge or can be predicted to emerge at one time, maybe earlier or later than another population. So I think that has to do with the history of the field and how the selection pressure has played out in the past for each population. So that's just something that going forward we'll have to account for if we're going to be using these models to make recommendations for farmers. But yeah, there's a lot of biological traits that impact which weeds are successful and which aren't. And a lot of that information is available in these two fantastic recent books that were published in the past couple of years. Our own Antonio Di Tommaso was a co-author on both of these. This Manage Weeds on Your Farm was lead authored by Charles Muller, the late, great Charles Muller, who is at Cornell. And these have been just fantastic resources for educators like me. It includes these tables, so you have all of the common weed species and most of the key biological traits that are going to impact their management. That if I get a call from a farmer about what should I be doing about this weed, say shattercane, I can quickly remind myself, what are the pertinent traits there.
Right.
And yeah.
Sorry, is the Manage Weeds on Your Farm, is that online, or
that's online? Yes, that's available for free online, and yeah, I encourage you to check it out.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. And it's been these books have been a huge help. And for example, in this weed identification and management webinar series that several of us put together with webinars on weed management for grasses, for broadleaves, for weed management in soybeans. I in particular really leaned heavily on those two books, and actually some of the slides that I used were even pre-made by the Di Tommaso group and Kerry Marshner in particular about how to identify various species. And I'll just quickly go through a few of these. But something that I did was really try to boil down the management information even further, just to maybe 2 bullet points. For example, velvet leaf has these densely hairy, velvety drooping leaves that herbicides a lot of times can just run right off of, and so there's issues with uptake. But it can be controlled effectively when there's 4 leaves or less. And velvet leaf doesn't typically produce seeds until the end of August. So for shorter season or earlier season crops, again, we could try to harvest those early and then come through and effectively till or burn down the remaining velvet leaf to prevent weed seed production. Burr cucumber can be problematic in field crops. It looks somewhat similar to our cultivated cucumber. It has these large seeds that enable it to emerge from rather deep in the plow layer. Most of our seeds just emerge from the top inch or 2. And yeah, what I'm calling an Achilles heel or something that kind of sticks out about each species is that for burr cucumber, it doesn't produce very much seed, and those seeds last a long time, so there's relatively little or few numbers of burr cucumber emerging in a particular field. I think it's a good candidate for spot treatments. Pigweeds. We have several pigweed species in New York, and 2 of them are resistant to different herbicide classes. With the pigweed species, I think one of the important Achilles heels is that the seeds don't live very long in the soil. They have a half-life of about a year. So if a farmer is really able to step up their control for about 4 years, they should be able to almost completely eliminate the pigweed from the seed bank. Purslane, I mentioned earlier, has very thick, waxy leaves. But it is very low growing and it's relatively shade intolerant. So it's susceptible to crop competition from crops like corn and smothering via other means. Crabgrass also is fairly low growing and spreading. So if it's in a lawn, competing with more erect grasses, if you're able to keep your mowing height higher, can kind of shift the competitive advantage to those other species. Barnyard grass has seed that, unlike some of our grasses or other weed species where the seed almost immediately drops to the soil and is incorporated into the soil seed bank, barnyard grass kind of retains its seed a little bit longer and through the fall. So it could potentially be removed through several different mechanisms, either hand removal or mechanized harvest time weed seed destruction. Horseweed, it can be a winter or summer annual. I mentioned earlier, it is likely resistant to glyphosate around the state, as well as some other herbicide classes. But it has these very, very small seeds. The seeds are wind blown, unlike a lot of our agricultural weeds that have seed that just drops straight to the ground. Horseweed seeds are tiny, and they're so in order to be wind blown and to be taken by the wind. And so they're so small, they don't have enough energy to push through very much soil. They typically only germinate and emerge from basically the soil surface. So they're very susceptible to tillage or soil disturbance to put them deeper, or crop residue or mulches to prevent their successful emergence. Common burdock and spotted knapweed are both biennials and typically only see them in very minimally managed hay fields. Some perennials, Canada thistle, field bindweed, quackgrass, and yellow nutsedge are all perennials with very aggressively spreading root systems. And these species, they store a lot of energy and carbohydrates in those roots. So it can take many years of repeated management to effectively control these perennial species. One tip that's typically suggested is that farmers use systemic herbicides that particularly applied in the fall when these weeds are preparing for winter. They're bringing carbohydrates and resources down into the root system to store that over the winter, help them get through the winter. And so if you apply a herbicide at that time, it takes the herbicide with it down to the root system and helps us destroy the roots. So those are just some quick examples. And this type of extension, I found a lot of support for it. There seems to be a lot of interest and demand from farmers. I get a lot of calls and questions after presentations. You know, hey, what is this weed that I have? I'll get photos from a phone, and then very quickly followed, how do I kill it? So this type of management or extension I found to be very effective, and I'd like to try to continue to build on this momentum, because this webinar series, these 2 great books that just came out, we have some momentum going in this line. And so in looking to establish upcoming new projects, new grant proposals, I wanted to build on this, but at the same time, I didn't want to bore farmers by going over all the species that they don't have. They want to know about the handful of species that they're really having a problem with, not necessarily all these others. So to make this more specific, I was thinking back to some work that I had done in grad school, doing germinable weed seed bank assays. So this is where we would take soil samples, typically 10 samples from across the field, mix those up, bring them back to a greenhouse, let the weeds emerge, continue to water, and encourage weeds to emerge over the course of the summer, record all those species. I'm thinking, okay, this might be a good way to bring this biological-based management information to a farm and really look at and tailor it to the species that they have. And in this particular trial or project, we found some interesting things. We saw, okay, that weed species and the weed community composition with these seed bank analyses was, excuse me, was somewhat explained by geoclimatic factors like latitude, longitude, growing degree days, and then to a lesser extent by soil factors, edaphic factors like pH, soil organic matter. But one of my regrets is that we didn't include any management information about the farm, like are they using tillage, what type of herbicides, what type of crops are they planting, so I think that adding that kind of information would be really interested. And so a group of us got together and we were successful in doing just that, and applying for a new project that uses these weed seed bank analyses to do this type of trait-based extension. And we'll be visiting 50 farms this fall. We're midway through that already. And these farms are fruit, vegetables, organic, conventional, field crops. There's a lot of urban farms that are participating. And it's primarily an extension project. So for each farm, we'll provide photos of their problem species and how to identify them with key features. Show how their weed seed bank compares to others. Do you have a small weed seed bank, or is it rather large? A lot of farmers like seeing how they compare to other farmers. But I think most importantly is we're going to really look hard at the species that they have and work to come up with tailored management recommendations, and base that on the tools that are available to each farm. I'm not going to come in and say, you just need to add on one more piece of Swiss cheese, and by the way, it costs $50,000. I'd rather come in and say, okay, if you move this piece of Swiss cheese an inch to the left, you're going to dramatically improve your weed management, really at no additional cost. So looking for those types of kind of win-win situations based on adjusting farmers' timing of planting, maybe crop selection, and herbicides and other factors. So there'll be 50 farms, and so it's likely that if you're a farmer in New York State, there's going to be one of those 50 is going to be very similar to your own situation with the weeds and what tools you have available. So we'll be translating these recommendations into several languages, having them available in print and online. And so far, yeah, we have booked the 50 farms. That I would like to give a big thank you to county-based extension educators, as well as researchers that have strong connections with growers, like Greg Peck, who helped get the word out. And the other thing that helped us is that we had a $500 stipend for farmers to participate. Although I do have some qualms with how Cornell handles the stipends. But yeah, this is primarily extension, but we do have some research questions that we'll be investigating. How do particular species correlate with crops? What determines where species are, where they are, and in which situations. We'll also be looking and screening for some herbicide resistance for suspected species. We're doing some novel things related to heat and enzymes to attempt to deplete weed seed banks. And we're also open to other questions. This will be kind of an interesting data set with 50 farms and all of the weed species encompassed with each of the farms. So we're open to collaboration if anyone has any additional questions. So a little bit more on the heat and the enzymes. So heat, particularly above 115 degrees Fahrenheit, really just starts to cook weed seeds. And there are a few ways that this can be established on farms. One of them is through using clear plastic, solarizing. And this is kind of a fun story. There was a high school student in the Hudson Valley who was interested in solarization and went to his local county extension service, who put him in touch with Steve Reiners, who put him in touch with me because I had done some solarization before, and we chatted a few times over Zoom, and I just gave him one or two suggestions about replication and some details, but this is really his independent project, and he got his own funding and just did some amazing work over the summer. And found treatment differences. He was looking at comparing plastic versus biodegradable film for solarization. He found hotter temperatures achieved in the plastic than the biodegradable mulch or film, and likewise more mineralization of NP and K in the higher temperatures. And he actually took this work and was successful. He got first place at a local science fair, is now in his first year at Cornell. I was hoping he was going to be on hand to sign autographs today. But yeah, very, very fun project to collaborate on with him. Other ways that heat can be used to target weed seeds, I was actually getting questions about from interested farmers. Steam is used to some extent, but it takes a long time, and it's not feasible on a large scale, probably. They're curious about boiling water, and they were thinking this could be applied quicker to larger areas. So I borrowed a camping stove and had these very small plots set out, representative of actually fairly large volumes of boiling water applied to the soil. And unfortunately, there wasn't a significant effect. I think that the boiling water didn't penetrate deep enough, and I think that it cooled off fairly rapidly to not actually kill the weed seeds that we're hoping for. And of course, with perennial weeds, it's going to be less effective anyways, as they're likely emerging from rootstock. But I was still very excited about this other new idea to potentially degrade weed seeds, and that weed seeds are typically covered in a waxy coating that includes cutin and xylem, and these materials help protect the seed. there are certain fungi and bacteria that can break down that seed coat using enzymes. They can exude cutinase or xylanase to help them break through and then break down the interior of the seed after that. And these enzymes actually you can purchase online through the magic of recombinant DNA technology. And so I actually did that and incubated known quantities of lamb's quarter seed for about 8 hours to each of these treatments, and then buried the seed for 6 months in a living soil that was kept moist, thinking that, okay, if the enzyme kind of gets the job started in breaking down the seed coat, perhaps the ambient fungi and other microbes in the soil could take advantage of those wounds and kind of finish the job, so to speak. Unfortunately, there was no significant difference between any of the treatments, and that was unfortunate. But I thought, well, maybe let me make sure I'm covering all my bases here and test the germinability, the germ rate of the seed, because if there was any type of damage, perhaps it would allow the seed to imbibe water more quickly and impact the germination. And it actually did. So there was a significant difference in the treatments based on whether they're exposed to the enzymes or not. And this is a modest difference, I'll admit, but I think it's still an encouraging result, and that maybe with improved methods, if we do this again in the next few years, we can increase that result. If we can get close to 100% of the seeds to emerge, then a farmer could just come through and control all the weeds in their soil and basically have weed-free conditions. I also want to mention that we've done some work in investigating this kind of new breed of mechanical weeding tools that is coming online to kind of reduce the burden on herbicides and hand labor. Lynn Sosnowski and I both presented at the Northeast Mechanical Weed Control Field Day this past summer. And Lynn actually recently purchased a Nio Oz weeding robot from France and gave us a great opportunity to help set up these or help adjust these cultivation implements on it. And our two undergraduate summer research assistants, Eric Verdham and Juliana Lee, got to help with that. I think it was one of the highlights of their summer. And they're now in their junior and senior years at Cornell, and I think have very bright futures ahead of them. So just to wrap everything up with a nice little bow, I mentioned there's another sense of different strokes for different folks that you might be more aware of than the boxing sense, and that, and this is the way that Sly and the Family Stone used it in their song "Everyday People," is that people are different, and people do things in different ways, and we should celebrate that diversity. And that applies to weed management, and that there's no single right way to manage weeds. You can do it a million different ways, and I'm improving in not letting my own biases affect my extension, but meeting farmers where they are. And 1 minute I may meet with a large scale conventional grower just talking about different herbicides. And the next minute, I may be talking with a small scale organic farmer about hand tools. So there's so many ways to do it successfully, and as long as I'm always trying to reduce risks, improve the weed control, yes, but also reduce risks related to the environment, human health, and the economic bottom line for the farm. And actually, this is a great example in itself of different strokes for different folks, in that some research from Maine showed that there's no single best hand tool. They're all good at different things, and the ergonomics of each of them fits with different people in different ways based on how tall they are or other factors. And so we actually applied for some funding through the vegetable program work team, and we have about 20 different hoes that travel around the state with kind of a hoe library to different field events, so farmers can test them out and see which one works for them. Whoops. And another sense of different strokes for different folks is that people have different learning styles. So a lot of us in Extension are really branching out from just presentations and one-on-one, using things like active learning and video, podcasts. And something that I'm excited about, hopefully unveiling in the next year or two, is something called a garden notebook, a campaign I hope to establish on social media that utilizes some of the drawing and painting skills of a few of us in the IPM program to reach out to a new audience, probably backyard gardeners who might keep this type of notebook with pest management information. What are the key identifying characteristics of different weeds, for example? And maybe we can work in some research-based management tips in there as well. So I've tried to include some acknowledgements as I've went. I've been really lucky to work with a wide variety of people in different disciplines, as a lot of us are struggling with weeds. And I just want to thank the New York State Department of Ag and Markets, as well as DEC, Northeast SARE, and USDA for funding related to some of the work I presented. So thank you.
Any questions?
We're looking.
Mark?
Yeah, so we've been reading about electric meters and lots of squirt films out there, and just other sort of newer kind of ways of approaching it. Where are we at with that? What's your opinion? Like, when will that, is that technology good?
Yeah.
Will it be adopted soon? How expensive is it to develop?
Right. Yeah. I'm guessing I should repeat that for Zoom.
Please.
Yeah. So the question is from Marvin about what is the status of robotic and advanced weeding equipment? Yeah. So a lot of it is still in the development stage, but yeah, there are. Yeah, I used to say 10. I used to say 20. I don't know. There's maybe 30 plus startups now that are trying to tackle this. They're seeing this opportunity of, okay, we're struggling with some herbicide resistance. We're struggling with labor shortages. Can advanced technology kind of take the place here? And a lot of it is, being at the early stages, and with economies of scale, it's at the very nascent stages. So it's very expensive, and typically it's mostly applied in very high value crops, particularly in California, where there's a high density of high value crops. So they can station a company there and maybe have a handful of these tools, share them between all the large farms in the area. But yeah, they're starting to expand out from California. It's going to be a while yet, I think, before the average farmer in New York has one of these fancy robots. But it does seem like prices are coming down, and they're becoming bit by bit more viable. Yeah.
There's a lot of different management techniques. It sounds like there's we doesn't really anticipate this weakness to grow with that sort of practice. Is there how far in advance can you predict your management recommendations, or are you really evaluating on a regular basis and doing reactive or proactive recommendations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what was your name? Claire. So Claire was asking about how far in advance can we predict certain weed problems and which species are going to be maybe problematic or challenging in certain situations. And yeah, that's a great question. I think that to some extent, some of these things are a little bit of a no-brainer, like glyphosate tolerant weeds and glyphosate if you're only spraying glyphosate. And there are certain suites of weeds that are typically problematic in organic vegetables, or depending on what type of crop it is that you're growing, or grapes, like I mentioned. So to some extent, we can get you in the right ballpark just based on like, okay, this is the crop and this is the frequency and timing of tillage and the herbicides used perhaps. But there's this other factor of what was the starting point of the seed bank? What's the history of the field before it was grapes? Was it in, was it pasture, or what seed bank had built up there and that would maybe still have a legacy of that in that given site? And if you're, I mentioned most of our weed seeds do, just fall straight to the ground, but some, like dandelions and like horseweed, do blow in. So what is the farm's proximity to sources of those weeds? Are you near a big field of dandelions that's going to constantly be coming in on? So yeah, I think that there's a certain baseline level we can predict, but there's an overall level of kind of random effects that is going to be unique to each situation.
Bryan, are there any examples of mobile steam-based weeding machines? Not weeding machines, but a field treatment machines.
Yeah,
they do that in Holland, with sandy soils, and around here with much more rocky and variable soils. I could imagine that might be a problem, but it works quite successfully in Holland.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. So Bill asks about, what are there examples of tractor-drawn steam weeders, and I'm vaguely familiar with some that that can steam and have the soil covered as they go. There's like a covering that keeps the heat in. Yeah, it follows the steam. And I know there was some research a while ago that looked at steam in combination with tillage, because it can be difficult to get the steam throughout that soil column. So if you're rototilling and also applying the steam, it seems to do a better job. It was the take-home message that I remember. So I'm assuming that there are examples of that, as they, I don't know if this was like a research-based a one-off that the researcher made, but yeah. And I'd be curious to hear more about in Holland. Are they?
I will try to dig up some photographs. I certainly took pictures of it, so I have to go and try to find it. Yeah, just for comparison's sake, for greenhouses is the most common area where I see steam being used, and they'll get the temperature up. They'll do it by bed, and so there's a hose that has holes in it that allows the steam to come out, and that's covered each bed. So I think they do it 4 times to cover a typical greenhouse, and they're 30 minutes each application. Yeah, very labor intensive.
Yeah. Yeah, Greg.
I think they've definitely tried that apple recruits out in Washington State, but maybe 15 years ago. Never really took off. I think there's a lot of complexity with trying to drive around an orchard with a machine that makes steam. Just keep that amount of water and the amount of heat going.
Yeah, well, a lot of energy. It's
A lot of energy.
They do have it for landscapes, and then they've actually adapted it also to foam, so that the heat stays in place longer.
Sort of biodegradable foam that.
Yeah. And along like fence rows and so schools.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, I think controlling the existing weeds with heat, it requires less energy than going into the soil and actually killing the weed seeds. But yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Oh.
So,
Okay.
well, I just had a question about since you get around quite a bit in the state and talk to a lot of farmers, see a lot of fields, different crops. I'm wondering, one of the things about climate change that we've always talked about is the weeds are really going to have even more of a competitive advantage over a lot of our crop plants. And I'm wondering if you're starting to see some of that come to be, that start to see weed species changing or difficulty controlling weeds maybe related to climate change. What are the growers saying? Just what are you hearing? What are you seeing?
Yeah, that's a great comment. So yeah, Greg asks in comments about climate change, bringing in potentially new species to this area or making our existing species maybe more competitive with crops. Yeah, and I think it's just very hard to generalize, because and Kerry Marshner and Tony DiTomaso have a Smith Weaver project looking into this and providing some extension results right now. And they've reviewed the literature, and it's very hit or miss and species dependent, based on C3, C4 grasses, dicots, and how certain species are going to will fare in higher CO2 versus higher temperature or more drought. There's just so much to it that we can't make a generalization. So for these educational materials, we're kind of providing key examples here and there of what might happen. But as far as what we're actually seeing on the ground, Tony is actively looking for Johnson grass is one that he is concerned about, as it's a very problematic weed south of us, and so if that comes into New York, it could be in trouble. We've already had introductions of others that are herbicide resistant, like Palmer amaranth, which is, I believe, native to the desert Southwest U.S. and perhaps due to climate change, it is now able to complete its life cycle in northern climates like New York, and that is, I think, typically regarded as one of the world's most competitive and problematic species. So, and that's unfortunately now in New York in a few different counties. So yeah.
Because for some related, but someone paying attention to what's happening in natural ecosystems. You talk about agriculture, but when I drive around, I see garlic mustard, Japanese knotweed,
Wild parsnips.
everything. It just seems like it's exploding.
Yeah.
And I don't know of anybody who's paying attention to that.
Yeah, and I have like I added this small component, so maybe 5% of my position it includes backyards and natural areas, and so I'm paying a little bit of attention, but I think it's mostly New York State DEC and others, USDA. There's someone at the USDA facility here who's looking at biocontrols. I think that if you remember purple loosestrife several years ago that just covered places like Montezuma, and now you can go and you don't really see it as much as they found a successful biocontrol. It's one of the most successful examples of biocontrol. And I think that that's where it really has to come from. That there's been efforts of eradication based on spraying and people going out with crews, but it's just so widespread at this point, especially like Japanese knotweed and the garlic mustard, that physically I don't think we have the human power to go out and make a significant dent unless there was a massive funding. But so I think that the way forward is really through biocontrol and with these landscape level issues like that, and that's an active area of research elsewhere that I just haven't taken part in as of yet.
All right, Bryan, thank you. That was great.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.